The summer heat pressed down on the crowd gathered at the Sanctuary of the Fallen inside the Heritage Memorial Grounds. Tourists with cameras, veterans with caps and medals, and families with small children stood shoulder to shoulder. Every eye followed the lone sentinel, whose steps cut sharply through the silence. His polished boots struck the stone with a steady rhythm, each movement measured, flawless, and deliberate. It was not a performance, but a ritual, an unbroken vow of respect for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Among the visitors stood the Whitfield family. Jonathan Whitfield scrolled through business emails on his phone, barely lifting his head. His wife Evelyn adjusted her sunglasses and checked her reflection in the dark glass. Their 13-year-old son, Brandon, looked nothing like the crowd around him. Designer sneakers, a trendy shirt, and a new smartphone clutched tightly in his hand marked him as the center of his own world. To him, this solemn ground wasn't sacred. It was a backdrop. He recorded short clips for TikTok, narrating in a mocking tone, his eyes darting between the guard and his screen. The stillness, the discipline, the weight of ceremony meant nothing. What mattered was the reaction he could spark online. His followers loved pranks, and he knew how to deliver one. The sentinel before him was Marcus Ellison, an African-American guard whose posture was steel, whose expression never wavered. His dark skin glistened faintly under the sun, but his composure did not falter. Every stride carried not just training, but history, the echo of sacrifices etched into his life and his lineage. Brandon, however, saw only an opportunity to get views. With a smirk, he bent down, grabbed a half-full plastic bottle from the ground, and with a flick of his wrist, sent it bouncing toward the guard. The dull crack of plastic against stone cut through the hush, and liquid splattered across Marcus's polished boots. Marcus did not break stride. His jaw tightened for an instant, but his steps remained exact, his body unyielding. The discipline of years held him still. The crowd reacted instantly. A mother pulled her son back, whispering sharply. An elderly veteran shook his head, muttering words heavy with disappointment. Phones shifted in the crowd, capturing the moment, not to praise but to condemn. The silence that followed was no longer quiet reverence. It was cold, heavy judgment, pressing down on one boy who had no idea of the fire he had just lit. In that careless act, Brandon thought he had created content. Instead, he had hurled an insult witnessed by dozens, an insult aimed not only at one man, but at everything he represented: honor, memory, sacrifice. If moments like this moved you, hit the like button and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Brandon Whitfield didn't notice the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He saw only the phone screen in his hand, the tiny red recording dot promising attention. His smirk widened as he lifted the device higher, narrating loud enough for nearby visitors to hear. "Look at him," Brandon sneered to his imagined audience. "Like a robot, just walking back and forth, doesn't even blink." His voice carried, bouncing off the stone walls of the memorial. The words dripped with arrogance, meant for laughs, not respect. Marcus Ellison, the sentinel in front of the tomb, did not move faster or slower. His body remained in the rhythm he had mastered through endless hours of training. Yet inside, a storm brewed. He had endured the scorching sun, icy rain, and sleepless nights of duty without faltering. But now, a 13-year-old with a phone mocked the very thing that defined his life: discipline, honor, and the memory of those lost. The crowd began to turn. A veteran in a wheelchair shook his head, his eyes narrowing as though he were staring at a ghost of everything his generation had fought against: entitlement, ignorance, disrespect. A woman holding a toddler pressed her lips together in outrage. Even teenagers in the crowd, phones in hand, whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and disapproval. Still, Brandon didn't stop. He zoomed his phone in on the guard's boots, chuckling at the water stains he had caused. "This is gold," he muttered. "He's really just a statue. Doesn't even care." Marcus heard every word. His jaw clenched, But his body did not betray him. For years he had practiced silence, practiced detachment, practiced the unyielding focus of the sentinel. But in that silence, he thought of his brother Darius, gone too soon, and of the vow he had made to never let memory be mocked. The parents? They noticed none of it. Jonathan remained bent over his phone, scrolling through emails, while Evelyn adjusted her scarf and posed for a quick selfie of her own. To them, Brandon's restless behavior was background noise, just another day in their curated lives. They didn't step in, didn't scold, didn't even look. Their absence was louder than his words. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Disgust rippled across faces. Some whispered, "Where are his parents?" Others muttered that no child learns disrespect in a vacuum. It starts at home. Veterans exchanged knowing glances, their silence heavier than any shouted rebuke. The air thickened with tension. Brandon thought he was climbing higher, gaining more attention, but in reality, the ground beneath him was crumbling. Every laugh he tried to spark only deepened the contempt around him. Every second he mocked Marcus was another nail hammered into the coffin of his own reputation. The ceremony was no longer about honor. It had turned into a test. One boy's arrogance against the patience of a soldier, one family's negligence against the collective memory of a nation. And the crowd, silent but watchful, was already taking sides. The tension had stretched thin, like a rope pulled to breaking. The murmurs of the crowd rose and fell, but Brandon Whitfield remained locked inside the small screen of his phone. To him, the disapproval swirling around him was invisible. The only thing that mattered was the clip he was creating, the shock value he believed would catapult him to viral fame. He glanced at the rope barrier separating the visitors from the sacred ground. Signs clearly warned, "Do not cross," but to Brandon, they were suggestions, not rules. He looked back at his parents for a moment. Jonathan hadn't lifted his head from his phone. Evelyn scrolled through photos she had just taken, choosing filters. Neither saw the storm about to erupt. With a quick breath, Brandon lifted one leg and stepped over the barrier. A collective gasp swept through the crowd like a gust of wind. Dozens of eyes widened. An elderly woman covered her mouth with her hands. A man in uniform whispered, "No, not there." But Brandon heard nothing. He grinned at his camera, tilted it to frame himself and the sentinel, and announced loudly, "Selfie with the robot guard. This is going to blow up online." He strutted toward Marcus Ellison, phone held high. The guard's steps remained measured, his back straight, his hands steady on the rifle at his side. But behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, his eyes locked on the boy. Inside his chest, the years of discipline and training wrestled with something deeper, grief, memory, and the sting of disrespect. When Brandon lifted the phone closer to Marcus's face, trying to capture the perfect shot, the line finally broke. In one swift, fluid motion, Marcus shifted. His hand darted forward, snatched the device from Brandon's grip, and sent it crashing to the ground. The sound of shattering glass cut through the air like a gunshot. The world froze. Brandon's mouth fell open, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the fractured screen, the glitter of broken glass on the stone floor. For the first time, the performance slipped, and raw shock took its place. The crowd erupted, not in noise, but in energy. A few gasps cut sharp through the silence, but then came the whispers. Some people nodded, quiet smiles flickering across their faces, a sense that justice had been served. Others looked on in stunned silence, unsure whether to cheer or condemn the guard's action. The veterans in the crowd, however, exchanged firm nods. They knew what had just happened wasn't rashness. It was restraint finally pushed to its edge. Brandon stammered, his voice breaking the stillness. You broke my phone. That was $2,000. His complaint fell flat against the weight of the moment. No one sympathized. No one rushed to his defense. Instead, the crowd's stares pressed down heavier than the summer heat. Marcus did not speak. He did not raise his voice or break formation again. He returned to his position, shoulders squared, boots striking the ground in steady rhythm. To him, the phone was just glass and metal. But the tomb behind him was everything. Brandon stood alone, his broken phone at his feet, the echoes of his arrogance crashing around him. The stunt he thought would make him famous had made him infamous in front of strangers, who would remember his face long after the glass was swept away. For the crowd, the moment was unforgettable. To them, it wasn't just about a boy learning a hard lesson. It was about honor standing firm, even when tested. The shattering of the phone had barely settled when movement cut through the crowd. Uniformed officers pushed forward, parting the sea of stunned faces. At their head was Officer Regina Miles, a veteran of the grounds, known for her steady presence and no-nonsense tone. Her boots clicked against the stone as she stopped near Brandon, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. "What happened here?" she asked, voice level, but carrying the authority of someone used to immediate compliance. The silence that followed was heavy. Dozens of visitors pointed, all at once, to Brandon. The boy's face flushed. He bent toward the broken device, holding up the shattered remains like evidence in his defense. "He broke my phone. He grabbed it and smashed it. You saw that." His voice cracked, high-pitched and desperate. Regina didn't move. Instead, she turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the witnesses. An older man wearing a veteran's cap raised his hand. "That boy crossed the rope," he said firmly. "He threw something earlier, too. He was mocking the guard the whole time." A ripple of agreement followed. Other voices chimed in, layering accusation on accusation. Regina's expression hardened. She faced Brandon's parents, who had finally lifted their eyes from their devices. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice sharp with indignation. "This is outrageous. That soldier assaulted my son. Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have lawyers on this before the day is over." His words landed flat against Regina's authority. Evelyn clutched Brandon's shoulder and added quickly, "We'll cover damages. Just tell us what it costs. A donation, a check, whatever makes this go away." Her tone was rehearsed, the kind of voice used in boardrooms and benefit galas, not sacred grounds. Before Regina could respond, another figure appeared. Colonel Angela Brooks, commander of the unit overseeing the memorial, approached with deliberate steps. Her presence carried more weight than any shouted word. The crowd instinctively fell silent. She faced the family directly, her voice low but unyielding. "This is not about a broken phone. This is not about money. This is about respect, or the lack of it." Her eyes locked on Jonathan first, then Evelyn. "Your son defiled sacred ground, and you stood by and watched. That failure is as much yours as it is his." Jonathan opened his mouth to argue, but her stare stopped him. The words died in his throat. Colonel Brooks gestured toward the tomb, standing behind Marcus Ellison, who had resumed his steady march. "That guard is not here for entertainment. He stands for every soldier who gave their life without ever hearing their name spoken again. And your child treated him like a prop for a video." The crowd murmured, their agreement undeniable. A mother in the audience pulled her son closer, whispering a reminder about respect. Veterans nodded, their eyes fixed on the family with quiet disappointment. Regina Miles finally spoke again, her tone like steel. "There will be consequences. This isn't just about one moment. This is about a pattern. A boy learns from what he sees at home, and today we all saw what he's been taught." The silence that followed was damning. The Whitfields stood isolated, their wealth and influence suddenly meaningless against the immovable weight of duty, tradition, and sacrifice. For Brandon, the broken phone was no longer the problem. The real fracture lay in the mirror being held up to him and his parents, a reflection the entire crowd could see clearly. The family was escorted to a quiet building just beyond the memorial grounds. Inside, away from the sun and the murmuring crowd, the air was cool but heavy with expectation. The room was plain, bare walls, framed photographs of fallen soldiers, a single table, and 4 chairs. Waiting for them was Dr. Naomi Sinclair, a psychologist who had spent years working with troubled youth and military families. She rose as they entered, her presence calm but firm. Brandon slumped into a chair, his arms crossed. His parents sat on either side of him, their faces still carrying the mix of anger and embarrassment. Naomi took her seat slowly, opening a notebook, her pen poised, but her eyes fixed directly on the boy. "Brandon," she began gently, "I need you to tell me why you did what you did." The teenager shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I was bored. The guy just walks back and forth. It's not a big deal." His words were casual, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the cracks forming beneath his defiance. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Not a big deal? You crossed into sacred ground. You mocked a soldier. You threw something at his feet. And you tried to turn it all into entertainment for strangers online. Do you know what that place represents?" Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "Soldiers, I guess. Dead people." His tone was flat, defensive. Naomi didn't raise her voice. Instead, she let silence stretch, forcing his words to hang in the air. Then she spoke, clear and deliberate. "Those dead people are men and women who gave their lives so that you could sit here today, free to make choices, even foolish ones. That guard, Marcus Ellison, stands not for himself, but for every single one of them. When you disrespected him, you disrespected them all." Brandon's face tightened. He looked down at the table, tracing a finger along its edge. "It was just a joke," he muttered. Naomi's eyes sharpened. "Jokes don't shatter trust. Jokes don't stain sacred boots with soda. Jokes don't humiliate a man carrying the memory of his fallen brother. This wasn't a joke, Brandon. It was cruelty. And cruelty grows when it goes unchallenged." The parents stirred uneasily. Naomi turned her gaze toward them. "And it doesn't grow in isolation. Children learn what they see. They learn what they are allowed to get away with. Today, your son showed the world not just his disrespect, but your failure to correct him before it reached this point." Jonathan bristled, but Naomi didn't flinch. Evelyn's eyes dropped, guilt flickering at the edges of her expression. Brandon finally whispered, "I didn't think it mattered. Nobody cares about that stuff anymore." Naomi's voice softened, but her words struck hard. "You're wrong. It matters to every veteran in that crowd. It matters to every family that has stood at a graveside, saying goodbye to someone who never came home. It matters to every American who understands that freedom has a cost, and after today, it has to matter to you too." The silence in the room was heavier than before. For the first time, Brandon's defiance gave way to something else. Unease, shame, the faint beginning of recognition. Naomi closed her notebook and said, "This isn't about punishment alone. It's about education. And tomorrow, your education begins." The decision was swift. Brandon Whitfield would spend 4 weeks performing community service at the Heritage Memorial Grounds. No shortcuts, no assistance, no luxury escapes. For a boy who had never lifted more than a phone in his life, it felt like a sentence heavier than he could bear. The first morning shattered his illusions. At dawn, while his parents complained about the inconvenience of rearranging their travel plans, Brandon was handed work gloves and a bucket. The grounds crew, most of them veterans, wasted no time. He was told to sweep long stone paths, scrub moss from headstones, and carry water to clean marble slabs. The Virginia sun bore down on him, soaking his designer sneakers with sweat and dirt. By the end of the first day, his hands blistered, his back ached, and his complaints fell on deaf ears. The crew didn't scold him, but they didn't coddle him either. Their silence was its own judgment. These were men and women who had endured combat, who had buried friends, who knew the meaning of sacrifice in ways he could not imagine. Brandon noticed the scars that lined their arms, the limp in a veteran's gait, the way one worker removed his prosthetic leg, to adjust it before continuing the day's labor. No one spoke of pity. They worked with dignity, and they expected him to do the same. By the second week, Brandon began to see more than sweat and stone. He overheard stories as the crew worked, fragments of lives etched into memory. A man spoke about the brother he lost in Vietnam. Another told of nights in Iraq when silence could mean life or death. Brandon listened quietly, no longer reaching for his phone. For the first time, their voices stirred something he couldn't name. The turning point came in the third week. Naomi Sinclair arranged for him to meet Helen Ward, a 90-year-old nurse who had served during the Korean War. Frail in body but fierce in spirit, she sat in a wheelchair under the shade of an old oak tree. Her hands trembled, but her words did not. She told Brandon how she had held boys no older than him as they bled out on cold foreign soil, whispering promises that they would not be forgotten. Her eyes locked on his as she spoke. "Do you know what that tomb stands for, child? It stands for them, for the ones who never came back. When you laughed at that guard, you laughed at every one of them." The words pierced deeper than any lecture. Brandon swallowed hard, his throat burning. He had no defense left. That night, as he sat exhausted on his bed, he realized he no longer dreaded the work. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was a duty, one he had failed to honor before. Meanwhile, his parents were not spared. Colonel Brooks required Jonathan and Evelyn to attend mandatory courses on parenting and civic responsibility. Sitting in small groups with other families, stripped of titles and influence, they heard blunt truths. Respect begins at home, entitlement destroys character, and children mirror the values they are shown. For a couple accustomed to buying their way out of trouble, it was a reckoning. By the final week, Brandon no longer needed to be pushed. He rose early, pulled on his work shirt, and joined the crew without complaint. His hands were rough, his sneakers ruined, but something inside him had shifted. He began to understand that sweat on his skin was nothing compared to blood spilled by those whose names filled the stones around him. The correction was working. The boy who once mocked was starting to listen, and the family who once excused was being forced to see. The 4 weeks passed, and with them, the boy who once mocked began to fade into memory. On the morning of his final day, Brandon stood among a hushed crowd at the sanctuary of the fallen. The rising sun bathed the white stone in gold, casting long shadows across the grass. Families clutched flowers. Veterans stood tall despite aching joints. Children were guided by gentle hands, their parents whispering lessons about silence and respect. Brandon's heart beat harder than it ever had during those long afternoons of labor. He had scrubbed stones, polished plaques, and heard stories that reshaped his understanding of sacrifice. But none of it prepared him for the moment Marcus Ellison reappeared on duty. Marcus marched with the same precision as before, heels clicking in steady rhythm, posture unbroken, gaze hidden behind his glasses. Yet to Brandon, every step now carried a different weight. What once looked like robotic repetition now resounded like a heartbeat for the dead. He felt the vibration of each click in his chest, a reminder that honor is lived, not performed. The silence of the crowd deepened. A veteran in uniform saluted. A child whispered to his father, "Why does he walk like that?" The man knelt, answering softly, "Because he walks for those who can't." Brandon's throat tightened. He realized he had once laughed at the same steps, blind to their meaning. Now they echoed inside him like a hymn. After the ceremony, Naomi Sinclair brought him into a small room behind the grounds. Marcus was there, standing tall, but no longer in ceremonial stance. He had removed his hat, revealing eyes both stern and weary. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Brandon's palms sweated. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then, forcing air into his lungs, he began. His voice cracked, but the words came clear. "I'm sorry. For all of it. I thought I was being funny. I didn't see you as a person. I didn't see what this place meant. I disrespected you, and I disrespected everyone buried here. I get that now. The words hung heavy in the room. Marcus studied him, his jaw set, his silence pressing harder than anger could. Finally he spoke. His voice was low, steady. When you threw that bottle, you weren't hitting me. You were hitting the memory of my brother Darius. He died in Afghanistan. Every step I take here is for him. And that day, you trampled on that. Brandon's eyes burned. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't look away. I can't undo it. But I want to be better. I want to honor what I disrespected. Marcus paused, then extended his hand. Then start by carrying the weight of your words. Live differently. That's how you honor them. Their handshake was brief but unyielding. It was not forgiveness alone. It was a challenge, a call to grow. For the first time, Brandon felt seen not as a spoiled child, but as someone capable of change. When they walked out together, the crowd noticed. Some whispered, some nodded. And in the quiet air of that sacred ground, a seed of hope was planted. That one boy's lesson could ripple further than anyone imagined. And as I reflect on this story, I can't help but ask myself, where do we draw the line between discipline and compassion? Was Marcus right to break protocol to defend the memory of his brother? Were Brandon's parents guilty of neglecting their duty, or was this just the arrogance of youth left unchecked? This tale made me think about how fragile respect can be, and how quickly it can be restored when someone finally chooses to change. But I want to hear from you. Who do you believe was most at fault? The boy, the parents, or the system that allowed him to act this way? And do you think the punishment was enough? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, this story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people, families, or events is purely coincidental. If this moment moved you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the other stories waiting for you here. Stories about honor, sacrifice, and lessons that can change not just one child, but a generation.
Don't you bow for the destination? Don't you pass more than hard moment love? Don't you bow for the destination?